In the spring of 1969, a young woman named Vera Holst walked into the Willamette Valley Growers Co-op office with the deed to her father's farm clutched in her hand. She was 24 years old, though she looked younger, with a quiet watchfulness in her eyes that made most people underestimate her. The air in the office smelled of stale coffee and fertilizer, a scent she had known her entire life. Mr. Albright, the co-op manager, a man whose waistline had expanded in direct proportion to the county's average debt load, looked over his spectacles at her. He had known her father, a man he respected for his work ethic but privately considered a fool for his stubborn refusal to modernize, to leverage, to borrow against the good years. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel turning in a cement mixer. "Vera, a tragedy about your father. A good man. Now, what can we do for you? The account is settled, but if you're looking for seed loans for the season," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely at a stack of papers on his desk. He assumed, like everyone else, that she would sell. It was the sensible thing to do. A young woman alone, with 160 acres to manage. The bank would give her a fair price, and she could move to the city, get a respectable job, find a husband. It was the way of things. Vera placed the farm plat on his desk. Her finger, clean but with the faint, indelible lines of engine grease etched into the skin around her nails, traced the boundary of a particular section. "I want to talk about these 95 acres, she said. Her voice was even, without tremor. "The sandy parcel, by the creek bend." Mr. Albright leaned back, a small, pitying smile playing on his lips. He didn't even need to look at the map. He knew the piece of ground she meant. Everyone knew it. It was her father's folly, the land that drank fertilizer and gave back dust. "Ah, the North Pasture," he said, his tone drenched in condescension. "Vera, your father tried for 30 years to make that ground pay. We all did. We ran soil tests until the lab technician knew the plot by name. It's marginal, unreliable. In a wet year, it's a swamp. In a dry year, it's a desert. We've quietly written it off in our projections for some time now." He was trying to be gentle, to let her down easy. The co-op, in its infinite, data-driven wisdom, had deemed her inheritance partially worthless. It wasn't a formal declaration, nothing you could find in a ledger, but it was a truth whispered over coffee at the diner and confirmed with knowing nods at the feed store. Holst's Sandy 95. A money pit. Vera listened, her expression unreadable. She had expected this. She had heard the whispers her whole life. She had seen the polite, sad smiles from the neighbors when her father would hitch the plow to his old tractor and head out to that field yet again. "So the co-op has no recommendations for it," she stated. It was not a question. "My recommendation," Mr. Albright said, leaning forward and folding his hands on the desk, adopting the tone of a benevolent uncle, "is to put it in the soil bank program. Let the government pay you to let it go to weeds. Focus on the 70 good acres your father left you. Plant corn, like everyone else. Take out a loan for a new combine. That old one of his is an antique. We can help you with the financing. It's the smart play." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the cage he lived in. A cage built of banknotes, commodity futures, and other people's opinions. He was not a farmer. He was an accountant of the land, and his ledgers told him her 95 acres were a liability. He saw a number in a column, a problem to be managed. He did not see the way the morning sun hit that field, or know the specific scent of its soil after a rain. He did not know the secret it held. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Albright," she said, rolling up the plat. She turned and walked out, leaving him shaking his head at the predictable folly of youth and grief. He believed he had done his duty, offering the only sensible advice. He had no way of knowing he had just dismissed the most valuable piece of land in the entire county. Let me tell you about Vera's father, Johann Holst. He was a man carved from the tough, unyielding hickory of the old world. He had come to Oregon with 2 strong hands and a philosophy that was as simple as it was unbreakable. You do not owe any man, ever. Debt, to him, was not a tool, it was a shackle. It was a storm cloud on a sunny day, a rust spot on a new plow, a poison that seeped into the soil of a man's soul and made him a servant to bankers and bureaucrats. He watched his neighbors buy bigger tractors on credit, build bigger barns with second mortgages, and plant fence post to fence post with seed bought on a loan, and he would just shake his head and go back to his workshop. That workshop was the true heart of the Holst farm. It wasn't a shed, it was a cathedral of self-reliance. On one wall, arranged with surgical precision, hung every kind of wrench, driver, and puller imaginable. In the center stood the altar, a heavy, grease-blackened South Bend lathe, a monument of cast iron and steel that her father could use to turn a piece of raw stock into a gear with a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch. Beside it was a drill press that stood like a silent sentinel, and a milling machine that could shave metal with the delicacy of a sculptor. This was where Vera's real education took place. From the time she was old enough to hold a file, she was in that shop. Her father never lectured. He taught by doing. He would be working on the old tractor, and he would say, "Vera, listen." She would stand beside him, her small hands smelling of solvent, and listen to the engine's rhythm. "You hear that?" he'd ask. "That little tick? That's a valve that's not seating right. It's talking to you. You have to learn the language." He taught her to diagnose an engine by its sound, to understand the mechanics of a thing not from a book, but from its feel, its vibration, its heat. He taught her that anything made by man could be fixed by man, provided you had the patience to understand it and the discipline to do the work right. "Buying new is an admission of failure," he'd say, wiping his hands on a red rag. "It means you've let the machine beat you. Or worse, you've let the man who wants to sell you a new one beat you." For him, every broken piece of equipment was not a crisis, but an opportunity, a puzzle to be solved, a chance to prove that ingenuity and skill were more powerful than a checkbook. This philosophy extended to the land itself. He saw the farm not as a factory for producing commodities, but as a living partner. He knew the rich, dark loam of the 70 good acres, and he was grateful for it. But he was obsessed with the 95 acres of sandy soil. The experts from the university extension came, took their samples, and delivered their verdict: low organic matter, poor water retention, nutrient deficient. Their advice was always the same: dump tons of chemical fertilizer on it, year after year. It was the brute force approach, the checkbook solution. Her father refused. "They want to force the land to be something it's not," he would tell Vera, his hands sifting the pale, gritty soil. "They don't listen to it. This soil is asleep, not dead. It's waiting for the right question." He tried alfalfa, he tried clover, he tried experimental grasses. He failed, year after year. The neighbors pitied him. Mr. Albright at the co-op patronized him, but he never borrowed a dime to fund his experiments, and so his failures were his own. They cost him time and sweat, but never his freedom. When he died, suddenly, of a heart that had simply worked too hard for too long, Vera inherited it all: the 70 good acres, the 95 difficult ones, the workshop, and the philosophy. The tangible legacy was in the shop. In a heavy steel cabinet, he kept not just manuals for every piece of equipment he owned, but binders full of his own handwritten notes, meticulous records of repairs, modifications, and observations. He had, in effect, written his own encyclopedia of the farm, and on the bottom shelf of that cabinet was a small, leather-bound journal. In it, He hadn't written about farming. He had written about ideas. It was a logbook of his quest for the right question to ask of the sandy soil. The last entry, written a week before he passed, was just 2 words: "Look elsewhere." So, after her meeting with Mr. Albright, Vera did not go to the bank. She did not call a realtor. She went to the county library. For the next 2 years, the Holst farm operated on a kind of autopilot. Vera planted the 70 good acres in oats, a low-maintenance crop that would cover the taxes and keep the land healthy. She did the work herself, using the old, perfectly maintained equipment her father had left her. The neighbors watched, saw her driving the ancient tractor, and shook their heads. They saw a girl playing farmer, clinging to the past out of sentiment. They didn't see the woman who, 3 nights a week, sat in the dusty agricultural section of the library, poring over books so old the pages crackled when she turned them. She wasn't looking at modern farming journals. She was looking elsewhere. She read 19th century homesteaders' diaries, botanical surveys from the original Oregon Trail expeditions, and agricultural texts from Europe and Asia. She was searching for plants that didn't just tolerate poor, sandy soil, but thrived in it. Plants that had deep taproots to find water and bring up nutrients. Plants that conventional agriculture had forgotten because they couldn't be harvested with $1 million combine or sold on the Chicago Board of Trade. She filled notebooks with information on buckwheat, on rye, on dozens of obscure legumes. And then, in a dry, academic text on historic oilseed crops, she found it. Brassica juncea, brown mustard, a plant native to the sandy, semi-arid plains of India. It was drought-tolerant. Its deep taproot acted as a natural plow, breaking up compacted subsoil. It was a biofumigant, naturally suppressing weeds and nematodes. And it produced a seed that, when pressed, yielded a pungent, spicy oil prized in certain cuisines but virtually unknown in American industrial agriculture. Now, let me explain something. The co-op, the university, the entire agricultural establishment, they were all looking at the problem through the same lens. They saw a field and asked, "How can we force this to grow corn?" Vera, armed with her father's mandate to look elsewhere, asked a different question entirely. She asked, "What does this land want to grow?" It was a fundamental shift in perspective, a change from domination to cooperation. She found the answer not in a soil test printout, but in a 100-year-old book. In the spring of 1971, 2 years after her father's death, she did not buy corn seed from the co-op. She used her modest savings from the oat harvest to order 2,000 pounds of brown mustard seed from a specialty supplier in California. She loaded it into her father's old seed drill, calibrated it with painstaking care, and drove out to the 95 acres the world had written off. The land was quiet. The soil was pale. As the drill cut narrow furrows and dropped the tiny, dark seeds, it felt less like an act of farming and more like the telling of a secret. The neighbors saw her and assumed she was planting a cover crop to be plowed under. It was the only explanation that made sense in their world. The mustard grew. It grew in a way nothing had ever grown on that land. The spring rains were sparse, and while the neighbors' corn started to yellow and curl at the edges, Vera's mustard sent its roots deep, finding moisture others couldn't reach. By early summer, the entire 95 acres was a shocking, brilliant blanket of yellow flowers, a sight so alien and beautiful that people would pull their cars over on the county road to stare. The hum of bees was a deafening roar. The land was not just alive, it was singing. Vera knew the harvest was only the first step. She could sell the raw seed on the commodity market, but the price was pitiful. The real value was locked inside the seed, in the oil. Her father's philosophy echoed in her mind. You do not let another man profit from the work you can do yourself. She needed a press A commercial oilseed press cost more than her entire farm was worth. It was a machine designed for industrial scale, for corporations, not for a 26-year-old woman with a field of mustard. Buying new was an admission of failure. She started going to farm liquidation sales. For months, she watched as the assets of failed farms were auctioned off. It was a heartbreaking tour of her father's greatest fears, families standing by, stone-faced, as the equipment that represented generations of work was sold for pennies on the dollar to pay off the very bank loans that were supposed to guarantee their prosperity. In the back of a dusty barn at one such sale, half buried under a pile of rotten tarps, she found it. It was a Knuth-style screw press, a cast-iron behemoth from the 1920s, once used for pressing linseed oil from flax. It was seized solid with rust, its motor long dead, its gears frozen. The auctioneer didn't even know what it was, listing it as scrap metal. The other farmers there to pick over the bones of a neighbor's dream walked right past it. They saw a worthless anchor of rust. Vera saw potential. She bought it for $50. Getting it home was a feat of engineering in itself, involving a neighbor's winch, a borrowed flatbed trailer, and a great deal of slow, careful driving. She installed it in the center of her father's workshop, where the lathe had once stood as the primary altar. For the next 6 months, that press was her entire world. The subsequent period was a masterclass in patience and inherited skill. She began by disassembling it, piece by piece. Every bolt was a battle against 50 years of rust and neglect. She used penetrating oil, heat from an acetylene torch, and sheer, brute force, but she never broke a single one. She laid out each part on the concrete floor in the exact order it was removed, like the bones of an ancient beast. She cleaned every piece with wire brushes and solvent until the original dark gray of the cast iron emerged from its orange shell of decay. The main screw, the heart of the machine, was pitted and scored. It wouldn't do. It would tear the seed meal and produce a cloudy, inferior oil. A replacement was impossible to find. The company that made it had been out of business for half a century. So she decided to make a new one. Have you ever wagered everything on a skill you only hoped you possessed? Vera took a solid billet of high-carbon steel, a heavy, unforgiving cylinder, and mounted it in her father's lathe. For weeks, she lived by the rhythm of that machine. The sharp, clean scent of cutting oil filled the shop. Tiny, glittering spirals of steel fell to the floor around her feet. She worked from old diagrams she'd found in a pre-war engineering textbook, but mostly she worked by feel, the way her father had taught her. The lathe was not just a machine to her. It was an extension of her hands, her eyes, her will. She measured, cut, checked, and measured again, working to tolerances that left no room for error. The community saw the lights on in her workshop late into the night and assumed she was tinkering, a lonely girl keeping busy. They had no concept of the precise, demanding, and audacious act of creation happening within those walls. There was a moment, late one night, when she almost gave up. She was cutting the final threads on the new screw, a delicate and unforgiving process. A slight miscalculation, a moment of lapsed concentration, and the entire piece would be ruined. The steel was hot, the work was exhausting, and a wave of profound doubt washed over her. She was alone. Her father was gone. The world thought she was a fool. What was she doing, trying to resurrect this dead machine to press a crop nobody wanted? She shut off the lathe, the sudden silence of the workshop deafening. She leaned her forehead against the cool, solid iron of the machine and closed her eyes. And in the quiet, she heard her father's voice, not in her ears, but in her hands, in the memory of his patient guidance. Listen to the machine. It will tell you what it needs. She took a breath, centered herself, and finished the cut. It was perfect. She machined new bronze bushings, cut new gears on the milling machine, and rewired a new, salvaged electric motor to power it all. When it was finally reassembled, it looked less like a machine and more like a sculpture. It was a testament to a forgotten way of doing things. It was a monument to her father. The first time she fed a bucket of her harvested mustard seed into the hopper was a moment of profound faith. She flipped the switch. The motor hummed, the gears engaged with a solid, satisfying mesh, and the great screw began to turn. Slowly, a thick, dark meal began to extrude from one end of the press, and then from a small spout on the bottom, a thin, golden stream began to trickle out. The first drops of cold-pressed mustard oil. The air filled with a sharp, pungent, wonderful aroma. It smelled like vindication. She began to press her harvest, working through the winter. She stored the oil in stainless steel dairy cans she bought at another auction. She never called the co-op. She never told a soul what she was doing. The co-op, for its part, never asked. As far as their records were concerned, the 95 acres on the Holst farm were fallow, a line item with a zero next to it. They were busy managing the bumper crop of corn their other members had produced, a crop so large it had crashed the price, leaving farmers who had borrowed heavily to plant it with a devastating loss. Vera, meanwhile, found a small, specialty food distributor in Portland, a man who dealt in imported olive oils and rare vinegars. She showed up at his warehouse one day with a single, unlabeled bottle of her oil. He was skeptical, but he was a man who trusted his palate more than marketing. He tasted it. His eyes widened. He had never tasted anything like it. It was fiery, complex, and clean. He bought her entire first year's production on the spot. The distributor began sending samples to his clients. Chefs at high-end restaurants. Buyers for gourmet food companies. One of those samples landed on the desk of a product developer for a major national spice company based in California. They were looking for a domestic source of high-quality mustard oil to reduce their reliance on expensive, inconsistent imports from India. They analyzed Vera's oil. The quality was off the charts, higher in purity and more consistent in flavor than anything they could get overseas. Then the phone calls started. At first, it was just one buyer, asking if she could guarantee a supply of a few hundred gallons. Then it was another, from a rival company, asking for 1,000. They weren't talking about commodity prices. They were talking about premium, contracted prices, 3 and 4 times what the raw seed would have fetched. They weren't interested in her 70 acres of oats. They were only interested in the product of the 95 acres the experts had written off. And so began the strange procession. Long-haul trucks with logos from California and Illinois began navigating the narrow county roads, driving right past the towering silos of the Willamette Valley Growers Co-op and turning down the long gravel driveway to the Holst farm. The drivers would get out, blinking in the Oregon sun, with a purchase order for a product the co-op didn't even know existed. By the late 1970s, the farm crisis began to hit the valley like a slow-motion hurricane. Interest rates soared. Commodity prices cratered. The very farmers who had laughed at Vera's old tractor and her father's stubborn ways were now in trouble. They had borrowed against the inflated land values of the good times, and now the notes were coming due. The bank, which had been their friendly partner in expansion, was suddenly a cold and unforgiving creditor. Foreclosure notices began to appear, tacked to the doors of barns built with borrowed money. The liquidation auctions became a weekly, grim affair. Through it all, Vera's farm stood untouched. It was an island of stability in a sea of red ink. She owed no man. Her market was entirely separate from the volatile commodity system that was crushing her neighbors. The price of corn could fall to 0 and it wouldn't affect her. The spice companies paid on time every time. She used her profits not to buy a bigger house or a fancier car, but to buy more of the one thing she truly valued: freedom. She bought the farms of 2 of her neighbors at foreclosure sales, paying cash. She didn't evict them. She hired them on as managers, paying them a fair salary to farm the land they had lost. She was not a predator. She was a preserver. One autumn afternoon, a car pulled into her driveway that was neither a truck from a spice company nor a neighbor's pickup. It was Mr. Albright from the co-op. He looked older, smaller. The confidence had gone out of him, replaced by a weary anxiety. The co-op was in trouble. Too many of its members were defaulting on their seed loans. He got out of his car and stood for a long moment, looking at the 95 acres, which were now a sea of golden brown stalks, heavy with seed, waiting for harvest. Vera met him by the workshop. She was in her work clothes, her hands smudged with grease from tuning the combine. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured toward the field. "Mustard," he said. It sounded like an accusation. "Yes," Vera replied. He shook his head, a look of genuine, profound confusion on his face. "We ran the tests. The soil, it's no good. It can't be." "How did you know?" It was the question he had come to ask, the question that had been haunting him as he watched her trucks drive past his office day after day. It was the cry of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered. Vera looked at him, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of pity. He was a man trapped in his own certainty, blinded by data. She thought of her father, of the long nights in the library, of the feel of the lathe under her hands. "You were trying to make the land do what you wanted," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "My father taught me to ask the land what it wanted to do, and he taught me how to listen for the answer." Mr. Albright stood there for what felt like a long time. The wind rustled the dry mustard stalks, a sound like whispering. He looked from the field, to the workshop, to the young woman standing before him. He saw not the foolish girl he had dismissed years ago, but a master of her craft, a woman who had played a long game he hadn't even known was being played. "We were wrong," he said, the words coming out as a quiet admission. "I was wrong. Your father, he was right all along." He extended his hand. "The co-op could use a supplier like you, Vera. We could give you a good price." Vera looked at his outstretched hand, then met his eyes. She did not take it. "Thank you, Mr. Albright," she said, her tone not unkind, but firm as bedrock. "But I already have a good price." The years rolled on. Vera Holst became a quiet legend in the valley. Her farm grew, but her lifestyle did not. She still drove the old tractor. She still did her own repairs in the workshop her father had built. The workshop itself was now bigger, with more modern tools standing alongside the old ones, but its spirit was the same. It was a place of creation, not consumption. She was now an elder, her hair streaked with silver, her hands permanently marked by the honest labor of a lifetime. She owned thousands of acres, all of it free and clear. The sandy 95 acres, the land the experts wrote off, remained the heart of her operation, the foundation of her empire. One afternoon you could find her in that workshop, standing beside her granddaughter, a girl of about 12. The girl was standing at the old South Bend lathe, a look of intense concentration on her face as she guided a cutting tool along a spinning piece of steel. Vera's hand rested gently on her granddaughter's shoulder. She wasn't giving instructions. She was just there, a quiet, reassuring presence. "Listen," Vera said softly, her voice the same even tone she had used in Mr. Albright's office so many decades ago. The girl nodded, her eyes never leaving the work. "You hear that hum? That's the sound of a clean cut. The machine is happy. It's talking to you. You just have to learn the language." The co-op said the land was worthless, a liability to be discarded. They advised her to follow the crowd, to borrow against a future she didn't control. But Vera kept the land. She listened to it. And in the end, the land remembered. It remembered the one who had asked it the right question, the one who had shown it patience, the one who had trusted its hidden strength. The land remembered, and it paid her back in dividends of gold.